Welcome to the Almanac's Research to Action interview series, where I sit down with educational research scientists to simplify their research and hopefully have some fun along the way. My name is Dr. Brian McGowan, and I'm your host for the series. With each interview, we'll pull together some additional notes and resources, supportive material in the show notes below. In this episode, I'm interviewing Dr. John Ratelle, Assistant Professor of Medicine, Consultant in the Division of Hospital Internal Medicine at Mayo Clinic. And we'll discuss his 2017 publication, Relationships Between Reflection and Behavior Change in CME. Dr. Ratelle, welcome. Do you mind if I call you John?
Absolutely, that's fine.
Okay. So as we do for each of the Research to Action interviews, we'll go through the four basic questions. Just in full transparency, you've seen the questions. You're not being deposed in any way unexpected. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so we're on the same page. So let's just dive in. So there's an article, the article that you published in JSEP in 2017. With keeping that article in mind, the first question is, what was the problem or question that you set out to answer?
Yes, so the problem, and thank you, Brian, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work. But the problem that we were trying to solve is how do we improve the learning outcomes in the context of conference-based continuing medical education. We know the literature says that CME can be successful, and it does work in terms of improving physician performance, improving physician knowledge, and ultimately, hopefully improving patient outcomes. But it's inconsistent, and we sort of wanted to explore how can we try to more consistently improve, particularly physician performance, and we tried to tackle that subject using the conceptual framework of reflection and reflective learning. In the context of our study, we define reflective learning as a critical comparison of new information that's being presented in the context of a conference didactic compared with existing knowledge frameworks that leads to a new understanding, clarification, or a change in perspective. And we feel like there's a lot of theory that supports that relationship between learners who reflect on information they're being taught and then ultimately changing their behavior down the road. But despite the theory and the rhetoric, we couldn't find a lot of empiric evidence supporting that relationship. So we sought to measure the relationship or the association essentially between physician reflection in the context of conference-based CME and subsequent practice change following the CME course.
Okay, so the segue into our second question around the methods you applied, and can you share a little bit more about both the analytical methods, the instruments that you used, the way you measured the results, but also about the intervention? You mentioned conference-based CME. Can you walk us through both parts of the methods?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the second question first. Just a little about context. So this was an observational study that we conducted at one of our CME courses. It's a 4-day course where we have anywhere from 4 to 8 30-minute presentations per day that are designed to give clinical updates to clinicians, mainly physicians, nurse practitioners, and physicians' assistants. It's very clinically oriented. So that was the context of the study. This took place back in November of 2016. And from a method standpoint, it was an observational study. And our measures, so we wanted to measure two things. Number one, participant reflection, and number two, practice change. So what were our measures for those? So for participant reflection, we had previously developed a psychometric survey instrument based on Kember's model of reflection, which essentially is a continuum. He recognized, and I would agree, that reflection is not an all or none process. It's a spectrum. On one end of the scale, you kind of have just habitual action. This would be like me just following directions when I'm trying to get someplace I don't need to know. I'm not really paying attention. I'm just kind of following the instructions. And on the other end, there's critical reflection, which fundamentally changes the way that I view my work or the world, something that's really foundational. And so we developed an 8-item instrument to measure sort of the spectrum of reflection with higher scores, meaning higher levels of reflection. And we measured it within the context of each presentation. So after each didactic presentation, we asked our audience to take a minute and rather than filling out kind of the traditional 1 through 5 satisfaction, type of evaluation to fill out this reflection instrument instead. And basically it kind of came down to, did the information presented here cause me to reconsider ways of doing my work and lead to a change in perspective? That's kind of the high level that we wanted to get to. So that was our measure for reflection. In terms of practice change, we measured it using the commitment to change framework, where at the end of our conference, we said, okay, now that we're done with all the presentations, we want you to write down statements of actionable things that you're going to take home and implement in your practice. So an example would be, we had a talk on pancreatitis that gave some updates on the use of intravenous fluids, and someone might write down, oh, I plan to use intravenous fluid X instead of intravenous fluid Y when I treat patients with pancreatitis. That would be an example. And what we did is we got this big list of commitment to change statements, and we were able to code them in duplicate back to the presentation we thought they stemmed from. It was usually fairly obvious. In cases where we couldn't quite figure it out, we basically just made a decision by consensus, so that each presentation wound up with a reflection score and a commitment to change score, basically the number of commitment to change statements from our audience. To try and ensure some validity of the commitment to change model, we also did a 3-month follow-up where we followed up with our participants, said, hey, these were the action items that you said you were going to change in your practice. Which ones were you able to successfully implement? So we could look and see, okay, not only did they say they were going to do it at the end of the course, but were they able to successfully implement them, 3 months out from the conference? And then basically we measured the correlation between the reflection scores for each presentation, the number of planned commitment to change statements for each presentation, and the number of implemented. That would be the ones that they actually said, the participants said, yep, I successfully did this at 3 months. And so we looked at those relationships. As sort of a secondary outcome, we also looked at, delved into a little bit about presentation characteristics that might be associated with higher levels of reflection. Are there things that presenters are doing? So we looked at inherent characteristics of the presenters themselves in terms of their age, their experience, their academic rank, and also their behaviors, the length, the number of slides. Did they use clinical cases, audience response, basically active learning techniques? So those were the methods that we used.
Okay, so in the spirit of the Research to Action interview series, this is the part where I try to simplify everything that you just described in a way, maybe using a little bit more layman's language. So observational study means this isn't in an experimental laboratory. This was a conference that Mayo Clinic was going to run, and you recognized that you could observe some dependent changes in the learning experience or in the learners based on 1 or 2 experimental approaches that you were trying to apply. You were just observing people learning. You weren't building an entire artificial experimental process. Fair to say?
That's correct, Brian. I think that's the key thing, is we didn't intervene. This was a conference that was happening already, and we just wanted to measure, are our presentations causing the learners to reflect? And if so, does that reflection lead to the learners to change their practice when they leave the conference? That's fundamentally what it came down to.
Yeah. And then, so there is these 30 or 31 sessions, which were principally didactic with some interactivity built into them, enough variation in the individual sessions that you could begin to categorize them as being using ARS or not using ARS, using case studies or not using case studies. And that gave you some of these secondary observations.
That's correct.
Okay. And then the actual measurement methods, you had this instrument of reflection, and you and your group have published around this a couple different times, but principally it's, not to oversimplify it, it was 4 questions added to your evaluation packet.
Yeah, that's it. We basically had the participants got this, and we printed off real nice. We find that our response rate's a little higher when the presentation or when the evaluation packet looks nice. So it was glossy, it had a nice little picture in there, and a page basically with each presentation and these items. And it just kind of, again, the items were along the lines of, hey, did what you learned during this presentation cause you to reconsider ways of doing your work, or do you plan to make changes based upon what you learned? Because that's really fundamentally what we wanted to get at, this sort of aha moments of, oh yeah, I didn't realize that we could be doing it this way, or that's new to me. I'm going to do that when I get home. That's what we were trying to measure when we talk about reflection.
Okay, so you have an educational conference that existed anyway. You were going to evaluate it in some way, in some evaluation form. You added some additional questions because you had this research question around identifying an individual learner's critical reflection around each session. And then the performance side. Again, there are decades of research around commitment to change, planned and implemented commitment to change. In this case, again, you added a couple more questions, an open-ended question around changes that the learner was intending to make. And I think you asked them to create up to 5 of these planned commitment to change statements, but simply another question in your evaluation packet.
Yep, and we saved them all for the end. We didn't want to bias in the mid. That was the one thing that we didn't want to sort of interject in the midst of everything. We wanted to wait till the end of the course and say, okay, you've gone through these 4 days, you've gone through the 30 presentations, we realize there's a lot of content. Now, can you write up to 5 concrete things that you're going to do when you get home?
Okay, and then from that round math, I've got it in front of me, about 79% of the participants at the conference completed the evaluation packet, although not all of them completed every question or every provided answers to every session. And of those, there were 409 commitment to change statements. So that's a pretty rich data set for you to start doing some of this math around.
That's correct.
Okay. And then maybe the one thing that is, I think the community may see as being a little bit more burdensome is that you set out for this 3-month study where you were trying to collect data from as many learners as you could around which changes that they had planned to make they actually implemented.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
right.
That's right.
And then if I'm right, the analysis between the plan changes and the implemented changes, that left you with 195 planned changes for those learners who participated in the 3-month survey. And you found that 67% of those were implemented.
Yeah, and I think that was an encouraging finding and gave some validity to our measurement. We know it's hard to do those 3-month follow-up to get people to respond, but fundamentally the majority of planned changes were successfully implemented, at least according to the participants, and that's really what we wanted to get at, and is consistent with some of the existing literature on the commitment to change model.
Okay. Your response rate, however, was lower than it was. Actually, I should take that back. It was higher than what I think the community generally gets, but you had 45 of your conference attendees eventually complete the 3-month survey. So of the 200 plus, 250 plus people who attended the conference, eventually you're dealing with a planned commitment to change data set of 45.
That's correct.
Yeah. But still, with so many commitment to change statements and then a solid book of the reflection questions being responded to in this observational study, where still I think it's fair to say that of all the energy that went into the conference planning and the conference implementation and this research arm, is it fair to say that 90+% of the energy and effort was on the implementation of the educational experience, and maybe 10% of the overall effort was adding in some evaluation questions and doing some analysis? Not Herculean amount of effort went into the research part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say probably even less than that. I mean, the research piece of it was, the coding was a little time consuming up front, but in terms of obtaining the reflection scores, that was easy. We just basically, when the participants of our course came and registered, they got their nice glossy, shiny evaluation packet, and we just made a plug for it periodically during breaks. Hey, could you guys take a minute and fill these out as you're going along? And that was easy. We were planning to do a course evaluation anyway.
Yep.
So the effort was low.
You did incentivize the 3-month survey?
We did. We put them in a lottery for an Apple Watch, basically.
Yep. I think that's pretty much an approach a number of groups have tried over the years. It's not that easy, right? At some point. Now, if you set the expectation up front about this 3-month survey not necessarily being something that is important to me, the educator, but also provides you, the learner, an additional opportunity to reflect on the changes that you've made, like you can kind of contextualize that 3-month survey to help the respondents or potential pool of respondents understand the value to them. Mm-hmm. But by and large, you started with a large enough data set that even though you had some fall off, you still, I think, have a credible overall data set to pull from. So we'll move to the third question. So given you've got these reflection statements, your primary question is around reflection and performance change as seen through commitment to change statements. And your secondary question is, was there something about each session that correlated with reflection? What did we learn?
So the big things were there was a strong positive relationship between reflection and both planned commitment to change and implemented commitment to change. So that was really the big finding, and that was our goal and hypothesis, to just provide some empiric evidence that yes, indeed, when participants do reflect in the context of a talk, that it actually can spur some practice change down the road when they leave, and becomes a useful framework now to start viewing ways to improve CME outcomes. Additionally, the take-home point were in terms of presentation characteristics, we found that two things, basically the active learning techniques of using clinical cases and using the audience response were associated with higher levels of reflection. Presentations that use those had higher levels of reflection, which again makes sense. So, reflection is an active process, and sometimes getting that answer wrong, when a presenter puts up a, hey, what would you do in this case scenario, A, B, C, or D? And I said option A, and it turns out the right option was option D. That's a discordance, and that stimulates the whole process of reflection from a cognitive standpoint. So that wasn't a big surprise, but supports the use of active learning techniques in CME didactic presentations.
Right, and I think in the literature that you cite, you refer to the disorienting dilemma. In other venues, we refer to that as the moment of cognitive dissonance. But importantly, I think most of the folks that are viewing this interview would think, well, that's obvious, right? If you're interactive, people are going to think more. But it may not always be the case. The literature is not robust or replete in evidence that that's the case. And because this was observational, you looked at some other things, some other attributes of the individual sessions that could have correlated with reflection, and you didn't find any of those others to have that strong relationship.
No, and Brian, I think that's a really key point, because when we look at characteristics, I think fundamentally what it comes down to is it's really more about the behaviors of the presenter rather than inherent traits of the presenter themselves. So when we look at things like years of experience, academic rank, those didn't always pan out in terms of leading to higher levels of reflection, but the actual behaviors. Now, ideally, hopefully experienced presenters who have a high academic rank and do a lot of speaking will be doing some of these things, but that may not always be the case. And so from a conference planning standpoint, we used to focus heavily on, identifying full professors and, trying to get the most accoladed individuals. And oftentimes we still do, but we also are keeping even more in the forefront of our mind, are these presenters we know are doing the right things in the context of their presentation. And it also allows us to give, junior faculty members a chance to present as well. If we've seen someone locally at our division who, has given or tried out a talk and we can see that, hey, they're doing all the right things, just because they're an assistant professor or an instructor, that wouldn't preclude them from being a member of our course, because we know it's more important about the behaviors than the inherent characteristics of the presenter.
Now, to get deep into the operational weeds, the science, your evidence suggests that the intrinsic attributes of the faculty member aren't correlated strongly to the reflection of the learner. However, you got to, I guess in some respects, balance that against the fact that if you showed up with an agenda of 9 faculty members that were all junior or resident, how many people are even going to show up at the meeting, right? So,
yeah.
We always struggle with, yes, she's not the greatest teacher, but she's a big name. Well,
yeah.
Okay. I mean, we don't live in a world of absolutes. And so making sure people attend is a critical step in making sure people learn. If there's no one in the room, there's no one to reflect. Right?
Yeah,
So,
that's right. And Brian, I think the other thing on top of that would just be context. So looking at that, we also measured, I haven't talked about it yet, but the demographic information of our audience, because I think knowing your audience is really important. And our audience primarily work in non-academic medical centers. They're really here for, give me some clinical updates. I want the pearls so I can go back to work and make sure I'm taking great care of my patients. And, I wonder if perhaps some of the focus on academic rank and accolades might be different if our audience was more of an academic-oriented group. Yep. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
Or there could just very well be a threshold where everybody that you had on your faculty was credible enough in their title and in their affiliations that they all passed whatever that internal threshold a learner may have in credibility. Let me ask one more question around what you found, because maybe I take a slightly different approach to thinking through this, but one way to interpret your evidence is that just because people are at an educational setting, they're paying for it, they're attending a multi-day meeting, doesn't mean they are there to think. Is that maybe another way to interpret this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly can be. And that, I think, historically had been the criticism of conference-based CME. And I think it still is to a degree, is that, we pay money to go to nice places and go to talks, and we go back and go to doing the exact same thing we were doing before. It's really an academic vacation, for, lack of a better way to put it. I don't think I agree with that. I do think that it's contextual, certainly, and it's a spectrum, but, fundamentally conference-based CME is the most frequently offered form of CME. And so we can't really just throw it away and say it doesn't matter. Obviously, point of care education in terms of electronic resources and whatnot are really important, but people have a desire to go away from their work, and sometimes being untethered from your clinical duties in the context of your day-to-day work can free you up to think more. I think it's just all about the way the information's presented, and that's why we've really taken it to heart to try and make our course the best it can be, because we really value and appreciate the learners that come and support us.
And there's specific things that you can do. You referred to them as faculty behaviors, but in the instructional design itself, what we learned from your research is there's at least 2 things that you can do that will increase the likelihood that learners are actually thinking.
Yeah. and it's active learning tech. It's keeping them engaged. That's really what it comes down to. I think our audience has demonstrated to us they don't want to just come and be talked at. They want to be engaged with the material and, using things like the audience response system and clinical cases that also give them a context for where they can apply the information they're going to learn. I think that's, one of the theoretical benefits of case-based learning is it's kind of an advanced organizer of, oh yeah, I see a patient like this. So I can see where when you give me this pearl about clinical condition X, Y, or Z, how that's going to apply to my practice. It kind of gives that contextual information in advance for people to reflect and build upon.
Yeah, in a separate interview, we spend 20 minutes talking about scaffolds. You just used the term an advanced organizer. In essence, you're scaffolding, structuring the content to be consumed, placing it in the context where the learner is almost becoming the protagonist in the case study. And then with the feedback that's being provided, you're allowing them to have that disorienting dilemma or the cognitive dissonance. I mean, there's so much richness there. That isn't to say that the methods were perfect that you applied, because you basically just did ARS yes or no, not the quality of the ARS, and you did case studies yes or no, not the qualities of the case study. Would you, if you could forecast a future research study where you looked at the quality of ARS or the quality of the case studies, do you think that this relationship would strengthen or weaken?
Oh, Brian, you're kind of cutting out on me a little bit there. I'm sorry, I missed that last piece.
That's okay. So the question was, in the methods that you applied, you tried case studies yes or no, or ARS yes or no. You didn't really get into the quality of the ARS or the quality of the case studies. So if you were to try to forecast your next research study, do you think that the quality of the ARS or the quality of the case studies would change the strength of the relationship?
Absolutely, I do. It's, I think, is it Glenn Roger has that kind of great analogy about a scalpel is only as useful as the hand that wields it. And I think that applies to the fidelity of any educational intervention that, it's all about how it's implemented. And, if we have an an audience response that's focused on, something that's not relevant to the learners, then it's not going to be inherently effective. It has to be applied in the right way. I would agree with that completely.
That would be another mountain worth of coding for you to do in the next study.
Yeah,
And so, okay, so we moved from the third question to the fourth question, keeping in mind that there were 4 reflection type questions that had been previously used in research. We say that they were previously validated, and you applied those to your evaluation. There was commitment to change, and we have 4 decades of commitment to change research, and you applied that. And so those are the tools, and from that we learned about these relationships. So if you're working in a med-ed office, CME office someplace around the country, and someone handed you this article, what are the 3 practical takeaways that you would expect a CME professional to take away?
Yeah, so I think 3 big things would be, number one, our hypothesis and hopefully what we've demonstrated is that when learners reflect, they change their practice when they go back home. And hopefully that just gives a useful framework to think about interventions. Now we've got sort of a ground to stand upon about, okay, how do we get our learners to reflect? And we're doing some research looking at some additional experimental studies about various interventions that we can incorporate into the context of conference-based CME. I think that would be take-home point number 1. I think take-home point number 2 from our secondary kind of questions about presentation attributes or instructional design, that using active learning techniques at a minimum are things that presenters should be doing in a context like this to try and promote reflection. So incorporating successfully clinical cases and audience response systems, getting the audience engaged matters. So giving that instruction to your CME presenters, and that's what we do when we invite folks and give them the details of our course. We say, hey, we've got data that shows that when you successfully do these things, it improves educational outcomes. So it becomes an expectation, really.
Yep.
And then number 3, I think one of the big take homes for us is what becomes the metrics for success for a CME course, or how do we evaluate our CME course in general? And we've actually now moved to using this reflective instrument as what we actually give back to the faculty when we give them their sort of end of course feedback. And that's been kind of an interesting sort of unintended observation, in that we previously used kind of just a traditional 1 through 5 satisfaction Likert type scale. And we've actually had presenters come back to us who maybe historically had scored very highly on a satisfaction score, who didn't score as highly on our reflective instrument. And that's caused them, I think, to reflect a little bit of a disorienting dilemma, because as you might imagine, I think a presentation can be very entertaining and very satisfying, but yet not necessarily cause the learners to reflect on their performance or really to improve. And so we're trying to balance both of those things. We think it's not a zero-sum game. You can create an entertaining and satisfying presentation that also causes learners to reflect, but that's essentially become our new metric: is, are we really causing change more than just satisfaction among our learners in and of itself? And we now use that when we coach our faculty and give feedback.
Yeah, what a great takeaway. One, I hadn't even thought about it the way you just framed it. Our community's constantly struggling to try to figure out how to measure more meaningful data points. And so we look for surrogate data points, or we look to the literature for validated surrogate data points, things that we can measure that are meaningful, that aren't overly burdensome to the learner, and quite honestly aren't overly burdensome to our offices, to our staff that are trying to do these things. And follow-up surveys provide interesting information, and chart reviews provide interesting information. And so there's these kind of go-to, quote unquote, next level approaches. You just came up with 4 questions that you put in that are getting beyond whether John knows something now he didn't know before, or whether he's willing to take some action now that he didn't know he should take before. But you're digging into, did John really think? Was John critically reflective in that learning experience? And your data would suggest that if he were, then he's more likely to make that change. So 4 questions, and you basically have opened up a new tool, or provided a new tool in our toolbox.
That's exactly right. And from the presenter's standpoint, I think they appreciate that. They're looking for ways to move the needle, because sometimes satisfaction in and of itself, may not be the most meaningful or even the most responsive metric. But you can think and look, okay, my content here, maybe I didn't really get the learners to kind of reconsider their work. Maybe I need to reconsider what I'm talking about or presenting about to try and stimulate that process more for the future. So I think our presenters, it was a disorienting in the beginning, but they've ultimately appreciated receiving that more granular, meaningful feedback on their performance.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the research. Thanks for the effort. Shirley, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
I look forward to talking to you soon.
Mm-hmm. Take care.
If you learned something in this episode, please share the lessons and share the link with your colleagues. The Almanac is now fully open access, meaning everyone in your organization or professional social network can benefit. Please feel free to reach out if you have suggestions on folks you'd like to see interviewed, or maybe there are published articles you'd like to have deconstructed or simplified. Just let us know. And you can contact me through LinkedIn or Twitter at Brian S. McGowan. And finally, before we go, keep in mind that with every educational program we build, there are thousands of opportunities to ask research questions. And with every research article that's published, there are dozens of lessons to learn. You don't have to be a research scientist to build great training experiences, but you do need to embrace the literature, and you do need to move past the status quo. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, never stop learning.